At 6:42 in the morning, the day after our company retreat, I woke up in my boss's hotel room with no memory of how I got there. By 7:15, six of my coworkers had already agreed on the same story. I had walked there on my own. I knew exactly what I was doing. Nothing inappropriate had happened. They said it so calmly, so consistently, that by the end of that first day, I had started to wonder if I was the one who was wrong. Then, 3 days later, the hotel manager called me, and she asked a question that changed everything. She wanted to know why someone from my company had contacted the resort that same morning and asked them to erase the hallway security footage. That was the moment the floor dropped out from under me. Because if my coworkers had simply misremembered a blurry night, nobody would be deleting video. My coworkers hadn't forgotten what happened to me. They remembered it perfectly. That's exactly why they were helping him bury it. My name is Elena Parker, and this is the story of how six people built a wall around the truth and the one thing they couldn't reach in time. And I'll tell you now, before we start, that the worst betrayal in this story is not the man. It's the people I ate lunch with every single day. Before I tell you about that night, I need you to understand who I was walking into it, because it explains why they chose me. I was 29, a client relations specialist at a consulting firm called Asteron Group, and I was good at my job. What I was not good at was the other job, the invisible one, the politics. I didn't golf with anyone. I didn't drink at the after-work things. I was the person who did excellent work and then went home to feed her cat. And in a company like Asteron, that makes you something worse than disliked. It makes you unprotected. When people talked about who was too serious, too quiet, doesn't really gel with the team, my name came up. And I knew it, and it wore on me because nobody wants to be the person the group tolerates. So when the annual retreat came around, I made a decision that I have replayed 10,000 times since. I decided that this year I would try. I would loosen up. I would be part of the team. The retreat was at a resort a few hours out of the city. 2 days of workshops, trust exercises, and, on the first night, a dinner that everyone knew was the real event. That's where reputations got made at Astron, not in the meetings, at the bar afterward. Our regional director was a man named Richard Hale, 47, married, and, on the surface, the warmest executive you could imagine. Richard remembered your birthday. Richard asked about your sick mother. Richard positioned himself as everyone's mentor, the generous uncle of the whole division, and people adored him for it. What people mentioned more quietly, if they mentioned it at all, was that Richard also decided bonuses. Richard decided promotions. Richard decided whose contract got renewed. There had been complaints about him over the years, nothing formal, nothing that survived. They had a way of evaporating somewhere up the chain, and the women who filed them had a way of moving on to other companies. And then there was my team lead, Melissa Grant. I want to be careful about Melissa because for a long time, I thought she was my friend. She was the one who pulled me into conversations, who told me I needed to be seen more, who said, that first night, that this was my chance to finally be one of us. I was grateful to her. I actually thanked her. Keep that in mind for later because gratitude is the softest place a person can be hurt. That night, Richard stood up with a drink in his hand and gave the little speech he gave every year. Tonight, he said, there are no bosses and no employees. Tonight, we're a family. And everyone cheered. But it wasn't true, and everyone knew it wasn't true because the whole room was watching who drank and who didn't, watching who made Richard laugh. In a family, Nobody is keeping score. That room was nothing but score. I had decided to try, so I drank. And every time my glass got low, someone refilled it before I could say no. When I tried to slow down, Melissa would lean in and say, "The boss is toasting you. Don't make it weird. Don't kill the mood." And I didn't want to kill the mood. That was the whole point of the new me. So I kept going, past where I wanted to stop, past where I was comfortable, into a place I had never let myself go at a work event. My last clear memory of that night is my own phone leaving my hand. I remember reaching for it, and I remember Richard's fingers closing around it, gently taking it. And I remember his voice, warm as ever, saying, "You don't need to call anyone. I'll make sure you get back safe." The next thing I remember is 6:42 the next morning and a ceiling that wasn't mine. I didn't know it yet, standing in that unfamiliar room with my heart pounding and my memory full of holes. But 6 people were already awake, and they were already writing my story for me. I need to describe that morning carefully because the details that felt like fog to me were actually the whole case. I woke on top of the covers, still in my clothes from the night before, my shoes on the floor by the door where they'd been slipped off, not kicked off. My head was a war, and the memories that came back weren't scenes. They were fragments, the kind your mind keeps when the rest is chemically gone. An elevator door sliding shut, a hand around my wrist, firm, guiding. Melissa's voice from somewhere behind me, saying, "He's got her. He'll take care of her." The specific sound of a hotel door locking. That was all. 4 broken pieces and a morning I could not account for. Before I could even find my phone, the room phone rang, and it was Richard calling from downstairs, already ahead of me. And I want you to hear how he did this, because it's a masterclass in how these men operate. He didn't sound guilty. He sounded concerned. He said he was so glad I was okay, that I'd had a rough night, that I'd insisted on coming up with him. His words, insisted. And then he lowered his voice into something that was meant to sound protective and was actually a threat wearing a cardigan. He said, "Let's not let one night where you lost control turn into something that damages your career or mine. We're both adults. Let's be smart." And he hung up before I could form a single sentence. I sat on the edge of that bed, and I did the thing survivors are trained by the whole world to do. I blamed myself. I drank too much. I made a fool of myself. This is my fault. That voice was so loud I almost missed the quieter one underneath it, the one that kept circling back to a simple question. If nothing happened, why did he call before I was even awake to tell me what happened? So I did the only thing I could think to do. I asked people. And that's when the wall went up. I went to each of my coworkers who'd been there separately over the course of that day, and I asked them gently what they remembered about the end of the night. And they told me, all of them, in nearly the same words. "You were completely fine when you left. You were totally coherent. You said you wanted Richard to walk you up." And at first I felt relief, honestly, because if they were right, then nothing bad had happened. But by the 4th person, the relief curdled into something cold, because it wasn't just that their stories matched. It was that their sentences matched. The same phrase. Completely fine. Totally coherent. 6 people do not independently choose the identical words to describe a chaotic night. 6 people choose the identical words when someone has handed them the words. When I said this to Melissa, she put her hand on my arm, the same warm hand from the night before, and told me they were all just trying to protect my reputation, that I should be grateful, and that I was clearly still shaken and should be careful about making accusations I couldn't take back. And then, before I had said the word complaint to a single soul, human resources called me in. That's the detail I hope you never forget. I had not filed anything. I had not accused anyone. And HR already had a document ready for me to sign. It stated that I had voluntarily consumed alcohol, that I had voluntarily left the event, and that the company had no record of any inappropriate conduct. A tidy little paragraph, prepared and printed, waiting for my signature before I had opened my mouth. They slid it across the desk with soft, sympathetic faces and told me signing would let everyone move past an unfortunate evening. I looked at that paper, and something in me, some small, stubborn thing my mother put there, refused. I said I needed time to read it. I did not sign, and I watched the sympathy on their faces cool by about 10 degrees. The punishment started immediately, and it was quiet, which is how the smart ones do it. Nobody yelled at me, nobody fired me. 2 days later, I was quietly removed from my biggest client account, the one I'd built for 2 years, reassigned for my own well-being. In a leadership review that got back to me, Richard had described me as emotionally unstable and going through some personal difficulties. Coworkers who used to eat lunch with me suddenly had other plans, and Melissa, my friend Melissa, was letting a story drift through the office like smoke. That poor Elena had a regrettable night with the boss and now felt guilty about a relationship she'd chosen. HR suggested, warmly, that I take an extended leave to focus on my mental health. They didn't want to fire me. Firing me would look like something. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to get so exhausted, so isolated, so doubted that I would quit on my own and save them the trouble. I was close. I want to be honest about that. I was 3 days from writing the resignation letter. And then my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and a woman's voice said, "This is Nora Blake. I'm the manager at the resort where your company held its retreat, and I've been thinking about whether to make this call for 2 days." Nora didn't work for Asteron. That's the entire reason this story has an ending. She had no bonus to protect, no promotion Richard could dangle, no reason to care except that something had crossed her desk that she couldn't stop thinking about. She told me that on the morning after the retreat, someone identifying themselves as legal counsel for Asteron Group had contacted the resort and requested that the hallway surveillance footage from our floor be deleted, citing employee privacy. And Nora, who had worked in hospitality for 20 years and knew exactly what a real privacy request looked like, and what this looked like instead, had done something before she complied with anything. She had quietly saved a copy. Then she said the sentence I will carry for the rest of my life. She said, "Honey, I watched it before I called you." And not remembering doesn't mean you agreed. I asked her what was on it, and she went quiet for a moment, and then she told me, and I had to sit down on my kitchen floor to hear it. The footage did not show what happened behind any closed door, and I have never wanted it to, and I'll say that plainly so you understand this was never about spectacle. But it showed the hallway, and in the hallway, it showed a woman who could not stand on her own. It showed Richard on one side of me and Melissa on the other, holding me up between them, my feet barely finding the floor. It showed me reaching more than once, clumsily, for something, and Nora said she was almost certain I was reaching for my phone. It showed Melissa handing Richard a key card, and it showed Richard guiding me through a door. His door, not mine. The story that 6 people had built, the story that I was completely fine and totally coherent and had walked up on my own, was disproven by 90 seconds of hallway video that a stranger had the conscience to save. I stopped writing the resignation letter, and I started building a file. Because here's what shifted in me on that kitchen floor. For 3 days, I had been asking, what did I do? And now, for the first time, I asked a different question. What did they do, and how long have they been doing it? That second question is the one they never expected me to ask, because women like me, quiet, unprotected, easy to isolate, are not supposed to survive the wall. We're supposed to sign the paper. I found the second piece of evidence almost by accident. During the party, someone had been filming the games, the goofy team stuff, and posted clips in our group chat. Those clips had been deleted from the chat the very next day, scrubbed, which should have been its own alarm to everyone. But phones back up automatically now, and one coworker's autosync had quietly kept a copy in a folder he'd forgotten about. And when I asked him carefully and promised his name would stay out of it, he found it. In the background of one clip, before I lost my memory, you could see Richard catch Melissa's eye and make a small gesture toward my glass. Keep it coming. And the audio, faint but there, caught Melissa's voice, laughing, saying to another coworker, "One more and she won't remember any of this." Won't remember. Past that moment, this stopped looking like an accident that a group had panicked and covered up. It started looking like something that had been decided before it happened. And then Daniel Cho knocked on my door. Daniel was a junior analyst 3 months into a probationary contract, which is the most powerless a working person can be. And I think that's why he'd stayed silent. And I think that's also why he finally couldn't. He stood in my doorway looking like he hadn't slept in a week, and he told me the part of the story I hadn't been able to see, because it happened while I was gone. At 6:30 the morning after, before I was even awake, Melissa had gathered the group, not Richard. Melissa. She'd assembled the coworkers who'd been there, and she'd walked them through it, calmly, the way you'd brief a team on talking points. Daniel repeated what she said, and it was the coldest thing I'd heard yet because there was no rage in it, only arithmetic. She told them a scandal would tank the entire division's bonus, everyone's, theirs. She reminded them that Richard was the reason half of them still had jobs. She said, and this is the part that shows you how these walls are engineered, that since Elena chose to drink, nobody was really at fault. So there was nothing to feel bad about. And then the quiet threat underneath, delivered to a room of frightened people. Anyone who tells a different story is on their own. That's how you get 6 people to lie. You don't ask them to hurt someone. You convince them they're protecting each other, and that the truth is just a bomb that will hurt everyone if anyone touches it. Fear did the rest. I asked Daniel one question. I didn't ask him to apologize, and I didn't ask him to grovel. I asked him the only question that mattered. I said, when you saw me in that hallway, did I look like someone who could have agreed to anything? And Daniel opened his mouth and closed it and couldn't answer. And his silence was the loudest confession in the whole story. Then I said the thing I'd needed to say to one of them since the moment I understood. You were afraid of losing your job. I understand that. But your fear became the weapon they used against me. He signed a statement, but I want to be clear. Exactly as I promised myself I'd be clear, he was not my rescuer. No man swooping in fixed this. Daniel just stopped adding his weight to the wall, and that mattered. And it was also the least he could have done. And both of those things are true at once. Then I found out I was not the first. Going through old company directories, I found a woman who'd left Asteron 2 years earlier, right after a different retreat. Her HR file, which a sympathetic contact let me glimpse, described her with a phrase that made my skin go cold because it was a cousin of my own. Attitude problems, difficult to work with. I reached out to her carefully, expecting nothing. She called me back within the hour, and when I described what had happened to me, there was a long silence. And then she started to cry because she had spent 2 years believing she was the only one and that maybe it had somehow been her fault. Richard had walked her to her room too when she was too drunk to object. And the witness who had assured everyone she was perfectly fine, the person who had helped build that wall 2 years before mine, was Melissa Grant. That was the moment the whole thing came into focus. Melissa wasn't a panicked bystander who'd made a bad call to protect her boss. She was a repeat participant. She had a role in a routine, and Richard, I later understood, had promised her a management position, which is the ugliest detail of all, that a woman would help do this to other women for a title. The company must have felt the ground shifting, because that's when the offer came. And the offer was almost the smartest thing they did. Through their lawyers, Astron proposed a settlement, a large sum of money, larger than I expected, a glowing letter of recommendation, a resignation framed as entirely my choice. And in exchange, I would not discuss Richard or Melissa or the retreat with anyone, ever. I was exhausted, and I was broke from missing work, and I will admit to you that I read that number, and for one full evening, I wanted to take it. I wanted to be done. And then I read the last clause. Buried at the bottom, in the flat language lawyers use to hide the sharpest things, was a line requiring me to affirm that I had no knowledge of any other similar incident involving these individuals. And I understood what I was actually holding. This was not a payment for my silence about what happened to me. My signature on that clause would be a weapon they could use against the next woman, and against the woman 2 years before me. A sworn statement that I knew of nothing, purchased and filed away, ready to discredit anyone who ever came forward. They didn't want to buy my peace. They wanted to buy my complicity in the exact machine that had hurt me. I did not sign. I called my lawyer and I said, "We're not settling, we're sending everything." We sent it all at once in one coordinated package so that no single person could bury one piece. To the board of directors over Richard's head, to an independent investigator, to the company's management liability insurer, who have a way of taking things very seriously, and to the appropriate authorities. Nora Blake confirmed on the record that Asteron had requested the footage be deleted, which is not a thing innocent companies do. Daniel withdrew his original statement and told the truth. The woman from 2 years ago came forward with her file. The party video was recovered and authenticated, and an internal email surfaced showing that HR had prepared my confession document before they ever spoke to me, which told the investigators everything they needed to know about whose side HR had been on. And when the investigation closed in around them, the wall did what walls do when the pressure comes from the right direction. It didn't hold. It turned on itself. Melissa's defense was that she had only been following Richard's instructions, that she was a mid-level employee afraid of a powerful man. Richard's defense, delivered the moment he heard hers, was that Melissa had orchestrated everything herself and he'd simply trusted his team. The two of them, who had built this together twice, spent the investigation pointing at each other across a table. I was asked to give a statement to the board, and I looked at the two of them, and I said the truest thing I know about how this works. He used the fact that I couldn't speak, and you used the fact that everyone else was afraid to. One of you needed me silent. The other one needed them silent. That's the whole crime. That's the entire machine. Richard was suspended pending the investigation. Melissa was suspended alongside him. The coworkers who had built the wall were placed under review. And HR, the department that is supposed to protect employees, was itself investigated for pressuring a woman to sign away an assault before she was even awake enough to understand what she was signing. Here's where you probably expect the ending, where I walk back into that office in a sharp suit, take Richard's job, and rule the people who wronged me. I know that ending. I've watched it 100 times. It's satisfying. And I didn't want it. I didn't want it for a reason that took me a long time to put into words. If I went back and took a throne there, then my whole story would collapse into one narrow thing: the woman who got even. And getting even was never what this was about, because getting even still leaves the machine standing, just with me on top of it. 6 people would never fully admit they lied. Some of them, I've made peace with this, will go to their graves telling themselves they were protecting the team. You cannot force a confession out of someone committed to their own innocence. I stopped trying. That freed me to want something bigger than an apology. So when the settlement was finally negotiated, I didn't ask for the biggest possible check, though I made sure I was made whole. I asked for changes, written into the agreement, enforceable, permanent, an independent reporting channel outside the company so that the next person who needs to report abuse never has to walk into an HR office that already has their confession printed and waiting. A review of every old complaint that had been quietly closed, including the one from 2 years before mine. A rule that any employee could report misconduct even if they'd previously signed a confidentiality agreement, because I had seen exactly how those signatures get weaponized. Mandatory third-party investigation of any incident on a company trip. And a re-examination of the personnel files of every employee who had ever been branded difficult or attitude problems, because I had learned what those words are often used to hide. They agreed to all of it, not because they grew a conscience overnight, but because by then, the evidence gave me the leverage to demand it. And leverage is the only language that machine has ever understood. I used the power I finally had to build the thing I'd needed and never had. A door the next person could walk through that wouldn't lock behind them. A year later, an email arrived from a young employee I'd never met, someone who'd started at the company after I was gone and had heard the story secondhand. It was 3 sentences. She said she had just reported a manager. She said this time, they believed her from the very beginning. She said, I don't think they know it was because of you, but I do. I read that email in my kitchen, at the same table where I'd once sat with the resignation letter I never sent, and I cried for a long time, the good kind. So let me leave you with what I actually learned, because it isn't a lesson about being careful at parties, and I want to be very firm about that. The lesson is never that the person who was harmed should have done something differently. Put that idea down. It was never mine to carry. And if you're carrying a version of it, it was never yours either. The first thing I learned is that a lie doesn't get stronger because more people agree to tell it. 6 people repeating the same story felt for 3 days like reality, like maybe I really was the crazy one. But 6 people saying the same thing doesn't make it true. It only proves that 6 people agreed to protect him. Consensus is not evidence. A hallway camera is evidence. A backed up file is evidence. The number of people willing to look you in the eye and lie is not a measure of truth. It's a measure of how afraid they are. The second thing is the one I most want you to keep. And it's the sentence a stranger said to me on a kitchen floor when everyone I knew was telling me the opposite. A person who cannot stand without help cannot give you consent. That is not complicated. It was never complicated. Every person in that hallway knew it. The whole machine exists to make a simple thing sound complicated so that good people will hesitate long enough for the wall to go up. Don't hesitate. If you ever see someone being walked away who can't walk, the complicated feeling in your stomach is not confusion. It's your conscience. And it is already telling you the answer. And the last thing. The real victory was never going to be those 6 people admitting what they did. I had to release that, and releasing it was its own kind of freedom. The real victory is that the next woman won't have to stand alone in front of 6 people who agreed on the same story. She'll have a door I helped build, and on the other side of it, someone who believes her from the very beginning. That's what winning turned out to be. Not the throne, the door. This was a hard one, and if you made it here, thank you for sitting with it, because these stories matter more when people don't look away. If it moved you, hit the like button, because it genuinely helps stories like this reach the people who need to hear that it was never their fault. Subscribe and turn on notifications for the next one. And I want to ask you something in the comments carefully, because I think the answer says a lot about all of us. If you were Daniel, 3 months into a job you couldn't afford to lose, standing in that hallway, what would you have really done in the moment? And what would you do now? Be honest. There's no clean answer, and the conversation in the comments last week was one of the most thoughtful I've ever read. I read every single one. Take care of yourself and take care of the people around you. I'll see you in the next story. If this story brought up something real for you, please know that support is available and you don't have to sort through it alone. In the U.S., the National Sexual Assault Hotline is reachable at 800-656-4673, and trained advocates are available anytime.